Welcome back. Tonight, we quietly explore the life of Marie Curie, her discoveries, her struggles, and the legacy she left behind. Settle in and let the story begin. The Warsaw Years. In the autumn of 1867, when the leaves along the Vistula River turned golden and the streets of Warsaw filled with the crisp scent of approaching winter, a child was born who would one day illuminate the darkness of scientific ignorance with the glow of radioactive elements. Maria Skłodowska entered the world on November 7th in a small apartment on Freda Street, in the heart of Poland's capital city. She was the youngest of 5 children, born into a world of political turmoil and intellectual fervor, into a family that valued education above nearly all else. Her father, Władysław Skłodowski, was a teacher of mathematics and physics, a man of dignified bearing and quiet determination. He moved through their modest home with the careful precision of someone who understood that knowledge was a treasure to be carefully preserved and transmitted. His shelves were lined with books in multiple languages, and his small study contained scientific instruments, glass tubes, scales, and measuring devices that gleamed in the lamplight, like promises of mysteries waiting to be unraveled. These instruments would become young Maria's first introduction to the world of science, objects of fascination that she would gaze upon with wide, curious eyes. Her mother, Bronisława Boguska, was the principal of a private girls' school, a woman of grace and intellect who managed both her household and her professional duties with remarkable skill. She possessed a beautiful singing voice and played the piano with feeling, filling their home with music even during the most difficult times. Bronisława believed firmly in the education of women, a conviction that was far from universal in the society of her time, and she ensured that all her daughters would receive the same rigorous intellectual training as her son. The apartment on Freda Street was always filled with the sounds of learning. The older children, Zofia, Józef, Bronisława, and Helena, would recite their lessons, practice their languages, and engage in spirited discussions around the family table. Maria, whom they called by the diminutive Manya, would listen with an intensity that seemed remarkable in one so young. Even before she could properly read, she would sit quietly near her siblings, absorbing the rhythms of their studies, the cadences of French and Russian and German, the logical progressions of mathematical problems. But these early years, though filled with intellectual richness, were shadowed by the political reality of partitioned Poland. The country that Maria's parents loved had been divided among 3 empires, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and Warsaw itself existed under Russian occupation. The Russians sought to suppress Polish culture, to erase the language and traditions that had defined the nation for centuries. In schools, children were forced to learn in Russian, to study Russian history, to venerate the Tsar, while their own heritage was systematically diminished. This suppression created a particular tension in the Skłodowski household. Władysław's position as a teacher placed him in a precarious situation. He wished to educate his students in the true spirit of learning, to nurture their Polish identity. Yet he had to operate within the constraints imposed by the Russian authorities. The family lived in quarters provided by the school where he taught, and their fortunes were tied directly to his employment, which meant that any misstep could have devastating consequences. Maria grew up understanding instinctively that certain things must be hidden, that there were conversations that could only be held in whispers, that books in Polish must be concealed when Russian inspectors came to call. This early experience of living under occupation, of cherishing knowledge that was deemed dangerous by those in power, would shape her character in profound ways. She learned resilience, discretion, and the value of pursuing truth, even when society placed obstacles in its path. When Maria was only 5 years old, tragedy began to visit the family with cruel frequency. Her oldest sister, Zofia, contracted typhus and died at the age of 14. The illness came suddenly, transforming the vibrant, intelligent girl into a fevered wraith, before finally claiming her life entirely. The household plunged into mourning. Maria, too young to fully comprehend the permanence of death, nevertheless felt the weight of grief that settled over her family like a heavy fog. Then, just 3 years later, an even more devastating blow fell. Bronisława, Maria's beloved mother, who had been fighting tuberculosis for years, finally succumbed to the disease. She had suffered in stoic silence for much of Maria's childhood, growing gradually thinner and weaker, yet always maintaining her dignity and her commitment to her children's education. In her final months, she had isolated herself from her youngest daughter, fearing that physical contact might transmit the disease. Maria would remember forever the painful distance imposed by her mother's illness, the inability to embrace or be embraced, the gradual fading of the woman who had been the emotional center of their family. These losses marked Maria indelibly. At the age of 8, she found herself in a household diminished by grief, a family struggling to maintain its equilibrium in the face of overwhelming sorrow. Her father, devastated by the loss of his wife, threw himself into his work with even greater intensity, but financial pressures mounted. Władysław made some unfortunate investments that failed, and he lost his position at the school, forcing the family to move to smaller quarters. To make ends meet, he began taking in boarding students, young boys who would live with the family and receive private instruction. The apartment became crowded and noisy. Maria's childhood home, once a sanctuary of ordered learning and music, transformed into something more chaotic and commercial. Privacy became a luxury. The family's reduced circumstances were evident in every aspect of their daily life, in the simpler meals, the worn clothing that was mended and remended, the awareness that every expense must be carefully considered. Yet, through all of this, the commitment to education never wavered. Władysław continued to teach his children with dedication, supplementing their formal schooling with private lessons in the evenings. He would conduct experiments with whatever simple apparatus he could obtain, demonstrating principles of physics and chemistry in the cramped quarters of their apartment. Maria watched these demonstrations with absolute fascination, her quick mind grasping concepts with a speed that surprised even her accomplished father. She attended a gymnasium, a school for girls, where she proved to be an exceptional student. Her memory was remarkable. She could recite long passages after reading them only once. Her mathematical ability was notable, her grasp of languages impressive. She moved through her studies with a focused intensity, as if pursuing knowledge was not merely an academic exercise, but something essential to her very being. The gymnasium operated under constant Russian supervision. Inspectors would arrive without warning, and at their approach, everything Polish had to be hidden away. The students would hastily conceal their Polish books, replacing them with approved Russian texts. When the inspector entered, they would stand and recite their lessons in Russian, praising the Tsar and demonstrating their supposed loyalty to the empire that occupied their nation. Maria learned to perform this theater while harboring her true feelings, her true loyalties, in a private place that no inspector could reach. The emotional weight of this constant pretense, combined with the intensity of her studies and the difficult circumstances at home, took its toll on young Maria. She drove herself relentlessly, sleeping little, studying late into the night by lamplight, determined to excel, to make her father proud, to justify the sacrifices her family had made for education. By the time she completed her gymnasium studies at age 15, graduating with a gold medal for her outstanding performance, she was exhausted. Her father, recognizing the signs of nervous exhaustion, made a decision that would prove fortuitous. He sent Maria to spend a year in the countryside with relatives, a year of rest and recovery. This period, which might have seemed like an interruption to her education, became instead a time of renewal. She stayed with her uncle in the rural regions south of Warsaw, where life moved at a different pace, governed by the rhythms of agriculture rather than the bells of schools, and the demands of Russian authorities. In the countryside, Maria experienced a kind of freedom she had never known in the city. She rose with the sun, walked through fields and forests, breathed air that carried the scent of growing things rather than coal smoke and crowded streets. She attended country parties and dances, learned folk songs, discovered the simple pleasures of social life among young people who were not constantly burdened by examinations and inspections. She wrote letters to her friend Kazia describing ice skating parties, sleigh rides through winter landscapes, the warmth of gatherings around fireplaces in country homes. This year, away from formal studies, allowed something in Maria to heal. The intensity that had threatened to consume her found a better balance. She returned to Warsaw in 1884, at age 16, transformed, still serious and dedicated to learning, but with a renewed energy and a broader perspective on life. Back in Warsaw, however, the question of her future pressed upon her with increasing urgency. Her brother Joseph wished to study medicine. Her sister Bronisława, called Bronia by the family, dreamed of becoming a doctor. But the University of Warsaw did not admit women. The paths to higher education that were opening for men in Poland remained firmly closed to women. If a Polish woman wished to pursue a university degree, she would have to leave Poland entirely. This reality created a terrible dilemma. The family's finances were strained. There was not enough money to send both Maria and Bronia abroad for study. Yet both sisters burned with intellectual ambition. Both yearned for more than the limited opportunities available to women in Warsaw. It was Maria who proposed the solution that would shape the next years of her life. She would work as a governess, she suggested, supporting herself and sending money home to help finance Bronia's medical studies in Paris. Then, once Bronia completed her degree and established herself, she would, in turn, help Maria come to Paris to study. It would require patience, sacrifice, years of delayed dreams, but it was a path forward. Bronia, 5 years older than Maria, accepted this generous offer with gratitude mixed with guilt. She departed for Paris to begin her medical studies, leaving Maria behind to enter the difficult and often humiliating world of governess work. Maria's first position was with a family in Warsaw itself, a relatively comfortable arrangement that allowed her to remain near her father. But the salary was modest, and she soon realized that she could earn more by accepting a position outside the city. In 1886, at age 18, she traveled north to Shizuki, a small settlement in a rural area, to work as a governess for the Żurawski family. The Żurawskis were landowners, prosperous and comfortable in a way that highlighted the distance between their world and Maria's. They had 3 children who required instruction, and Maria's duties were to provide that instruction while living in their household. She arrived at their country estate in winter, when snow blanketed the fields and the isolation of the countryside was most pronounced. The work itself was not particularly difficult. The children were manageable, and Maria approached their education with the same seriousness she brought to everything. But the position of governess was ambiguous and often uncomfortable. She was not a servant, exactly, yet neither was she considered an equal by the family. She occupied a liminal space, educated and cultured, but employed and subordinate. She took her meals separately from the family, lived in quarters set apart, was expected to be available for their needs while maintaining an appropriate social distance. What made this bearable was the time Maria could claim for herself. In the evenings, after her duties were complete, she would retreat to her small room and pursue her own studies. She had brought books with her mathematics, physics, literature in multiple languages. She read by lamplight, working through complex problems, teaching herself advanced concepts. Determined that these years of exile from formal education would not become years of intellectual stagnation, she also became involved in the Floating University, a clandestine educational initiative that operated in defiance of Russian restrictions. This underground institution offered courses taught by Polish scholars to Polish students, particularly women who were excluded from official universities. The classes were held in secret, in private apartments, moving locations to avoid detection. Participants risked punishment if discovered. Maria became both a student and a teacher in this illegal enterprise, traveling to Warsaw during her occasional periods of leave to attend lectures and to teach reading and writing to Polish peasant children, sharing knowledge with those who had even less access to education than she did. During her time with the Żurawskis, Maria fell in love. Kazimierz Żurawski, the eldest son of the family, was studying mathematics at the University of Warsaw. He was intelligent, cultured, and he recognized Maria's exceptional mind. They spent time together during his visits home, discussing mathematics and literature, sharing their thoughts and dreams. A romance developed, secret at first, then acknowledged between them with the intensity that comes from young love. Maria allowed herself to hope that they might marry, that she might find personal happiness while still pursuing her intellectual ambitions. Kazimierz spoke of their future together, made promises, created visions of a life they would share. But when the question of marriage arose concretely, when Kazimierz's parents learned of their son's intentions, the response was swift and unambiguous. Maria was a governess, without fortune or significant social position. She was unsuitable as a wife for their son, the heir to their estate. They forbade the marriage. Kazimierz, faced with his parents' opposition and the threat of disinheritance, capitulated. Whatever feelings he had for Maria, they were not strong enough to overcome his family's objections. The romance ended, and Maria was left with a broken heart and a bitter lesson about the constraints that society placed on women, particularly those without wealth or family connection. She remained in the Żurawskis' employ for more than a year after this romantic disappointment, a situation that required tremendous strength of character. To continue living in the household, maintaining her professional dignity, teaching the younger Żurawski children while nursing her private heartbreak. It was a test of resilience that Maria passed, but not without cost. She wrote to her brother, Józef, of her despair, her sense that life stretched before her as an endless series of disappointments. Yet she continued sending money to Bronia in Paris. She continued her private studies. She continued teaching in the underground educational movement. Even in her darkest moments, the commitment to knowledge, to the life of the mind, remained constant. In 1889, after 3 years in Shizuki, Maria finally left the Żurawski household. She took another governess position, this time closer to Warsaw, with a family who proved more congenial. Her spirits began to lift. Bronia was making good progress in Paris, and the promised time when Maria herself might go to study abroad seemed less impossibly distant. Then, in 1890, came news that changed everything. Bronia had completed her medical studies and had married Kazimierz Dłuski, a fellow Polish student who was also a doctor. The couple wrote to Maria with an invitation. "Come to Paris, live with us, begin your studies." The years of waiting, the years of sacrifice, had finally borne fruit. But Maria hesitated. Her father was aging, living alone in Warsaw. Could she really leave him? And even with Bronia's support, studying in Paris would require money. She delayed, uncertain, pulled between duty to her father and the dream of education, between the safe known world of Warsaw and the frightening possibilities of Paris. Finally, in the autumn of 1891, Maria made her decision. She would go. Her father, understanding the magnitude of this opportunity, encouraged her departure despite his own loneliness. She packed her few belongings, gathered the money she had saved through years of work, purchased a fourth-class train ticket, the cheapest available, and set out on the long journey from Warsaw to Paris. The Paris years begin. The train journey from Warsaw to Paris took more than 40 hours, crossing borders and traversing landscapes that shifted from the familiar plains of Poland through the mountains of Central Europe and finally into France. Maria traveled in the fourth-class compartment, where passengers sat on hard wooden benches, where there was no heat despite the November cold, where she brought her own food, because there was no dining car accessible to those of her class. She sat among peasants and laborers, working people making their difficult way across Europe, and she did not mind the discomfort. Her mind was turned entirely forward, toward the city that awaited her, toward the Sorbonne and the laboratories, toward the life of study that had been her dream for so long. She had brought books with her and read by the dim light of the compartment, French scientific texts that she studied as the landscape rushed past the windows. Paris in 1891 was a city transformed. The boulevards that Baron Haussmann had created cut through the medieval tangle of old streets, creating grand vistas and modern thoroughfares. The Eiffel Tower, completed just 2 years earlier, rose above the cityscape like a monument to the age of iron and engineering. Gaslights illuminated the streets, and the city thrummed with artistic and intellectual energy. It was the Paris of the Belle Époque, a golden age of culture and innovation, where the cafes filled with artists and philosophers, where scientific societies met to discuss the latest discoveries, where everything seemed possible. Maria arrived at the Gare du Nord and made her way through streets that bewildered her with their noise and crowds and foreignness. She spoke French, had studied it since childhood, but the rapid Parisian dialect was difficult to follow at first. The city was enormous compared to Warsaw, overwhelming in its scale and bustle. She went to the Latin Quarter, where Bronia and Kazimierz Dłuski had established their household and medical practice. They welcomed her warmly into a small apartment that already felt crowded with the two of them. They cleared a space for Maria, gave her what privacy they could, and immediately began helping her navigate the process of enrollment at the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne, the University of Paris, had been admitting women for several years, though they remained a small minority among the students. Maria registered in the Faculty of Sciences, intending to pursue a degree in physics. When she signed the registration documents, she used the French version of her name, Marie. Maria Skłodowska became Marie Skłodowska, a small transformation that signaled her entry into this new world. Living with Bronia and Kazimierz proved difficult, though through no fault of theirs. The apartment was in a lively part of the city, full of noise and social activity. The couple maintained an active social life, entertaining fellow Polish expatriates, hosting dinners and gatherings. They were generous and kind, but their household was not conducive to the intensive study that Marie craved. Moreover, the commute from their apartment to the Sorbonne was long, and Marie found that she was wasting precious time traveling back and forth, time that she desperately wanted to spend in libraries and lecture halls. After several months of this arrangement, in the spring of 1892, she made a decision that demonstrated both her independence and her willingness to endure hardship for the sake of her education. She moved out. She rented a tiny attic room in the Latin Quarter, close to the Sorbonne, in the kind of cheap student lodging that prioritized location over any semblance of comfort. The room was on the 6th floor of a narrow building, reachable only by climbing a steep staircase. It was so small that it barely accommodated a bed, a table, a chair, and a washstand. It had no heat except for a small stove, and fuel was expensive. Marie furnished this space with the minimum necessities, purchased from second-hand shops. She covered the window with a thin curtain. She arranged her books on the table and considered the room adequate. She could walk to the university in minutes. She could study without interruption. The physical privations seemed a small price to pay for this proximity to knowledge. The privations, however, were real. Paris winters were cold, and Marie had little money for coal or wood to heat her room. She would wake on winter mornings to find that the water in her wash basin had frozen during the night. She would dress in layers, wearing all the clothes she owned to try to keep warm. When the cold became unbearable, she would go to the library, which was heated, and study there until closing time, reluctant to return to her frigid room. She ate little and poorly, Her budget was extremely tight. Her father sent what he could spare, and she supplemented this with what remained of her savings from governess work, but it was never quite enough. She would buy a small bag of coal, a few groceries, bread, eggs, fruit, chocolate, and try to make them last as long as possible. She prepared simple meals on her small stove or ate her food cold to save fuel. Often, she was so absorbed in her studies that she simply forgot to eat. She would work through mealtimes without noticing, then continue studying until she was too tired to bother preparing food. She grew thin. Her clothes, never numerous, became loose on her frame. Her days developed a rhythm governed entirely by learning. She would rise early and go immediately to the Sorbonne, attending lectures on physics and mathematics. The professors distinguished men like Paul Appel, Gabriel Lippmann, and Edward Branly presented material that challenged and excited her. She sat in the lecture halls, one of very few women among crowds of male students, and filled notebooks with careful notes. After lectures, she would go to the library, where she would work through the day's material, solving problems, reading additional texts, pushing herself to master concepts fully before moving forward. The library became her refuge, a warm, quiet space where she could lose herself completely in mathematics and physics. She would remain until the library closed, often among the last students to leave. Then she would return to her cold room and continue studying by lamplight, working late into the night. Sometimes she studied until she literally fell asleep over her books, waking hours later with her head on the table and her lamp burned low. This was not a sustainable way to live, but Marie was driven by something deeper than practical considerations. She had waited so long for this opportunity. She had sacrificed years of her youth, had worked in positions of subordination, had postponed her dreams while others pursued theirs. Now, finally, she was here, at the Sorbonne, learning physics and mathematics from some of the finest minds in Europe. The physical hardships seemed irrelevant compared to the intellectual feast before her. Her fellow students noticed the intense young woman with the serious expression and the worn clothes. Some regarded her with curiosity, others with a certain dismissiveness. Women studying science were still unusual enough to attract attention, and not all of it was friendly. But Marie was indifferent to social dynamics. She did not attend student cafes or social gatherings. She did not seek friendships or diversions. She existed, during those first years in Paris, almost entirely in the realm of the mind. Occasionally, Bronia would insist that Marie come for a proper meal, and Marie would arrive at her sister's apartment, looking pale and exhausted. Bronia would feed her, scold her gently for not taking better care of herself, press money on her that Marie would reluctantly accept. Once, Marie fainted during a visit, and Bronia discovered that she had been living on bread and fruit for weeks, too absorbed in her studies and too proud to ask for help, even when her money had run out. Despite, or perhaps because of this total dedication, Marie's academic performance was exceptional. She moved through the curriculum with remarkable speed and understanding. The physics that she studied was on the cusp of revolutionary discoveries. Scientists were beginning to explore electricity and magnetism in new ways, to investigate the nature of matter at increasingly fundamental levels. The classical physics of Newton was being questioned and expanded. It was an exciting time to be studying the physical sciences, and Marie absorbed it all with passionate intensity. In 1893, she took the examination for her license as Sciences Physiques, roughly equivalent to a master's degree. When the results were announced, Marie Skłodowska's name appeared first on the list. She had earned the highest marks in her cohort, an extraordinary achievement for any student, and particularly notable for a foreign woman who had arrived in France just 2 years earlier with limited resources and imperfect French. This success should have marked a natural conclusion to her studies. She had achieved what she had come to Paris to accomplish. She could have returned to Poland, sought a teaching position, begun to earn a living, and perhaps to pay back the debts she had accumulated. But Marie was not ready to leave. Her appetite for learning had only grown stronger. She decided to pursue a second degree, this time in mathematics. To support herself through this additional study, she needed money. She applied for and received a fellowship from the Society for the Encouragement of National Industry, a scholarship designed to support Polish students studying abroad. The money was modest, but it was enough to allow her to continue. She found new lodgings, another small room, equally sparse and cold. She began attending mathematics lectures, filling new notebooks with careful notations. The rhythm of her life continued: lectures, library, private study, occasional visits to Bronia, the constant background of hunger and cold and exhaustion that she accepted as the necessary conditions of learning. In 1894, she completed her mathematics degree, finishing second in her cohort. Now, surely, her student days were over. She began to make plans to return to Poland, to begin the next phase of her life. She visited Bronia to discuss her intentions, her future, the question of what she would do with all this carefully acquired knowledge. It was during one of these visits that Bronia mentioned a young physicist named Marie Curie. Marie needed access to laboratory space to conduct some research for a client. She had been hired by the Society for the Encouragement of National Industry to study the magnetic properties of different steels, a practical application of her physics knowledge. She needed equipment and workspace that the Sorbonne did not readily make available to a foreign student, particularly a woman. Bronia knew a Polish physicist, Professor Józef Kowalski, who was visiting Paris. Kowalski, in turn, knew Marie Curie, who worked as chief of laboratory at the Municipal School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry. Perhaps, Kowalski suggested, Marie Curie might have laboratory space available. An introduction was arranged. In the spring of 1894, Marie Skłodowska met Marie Curie for the first time, a meeting that would change the course of both their lives and, ultimately, the course of scientific history. Part 3. Pierre Curie was 35 years old when he met Marie, 8 years her senior. He was tall and somewhat stooped, with a gentle manner and an abstracted air, as if his mind was always partly elsewhere, contemplating questions invisible to others. He had a reddish-brown beard that he kept neatly trimmed, and his eyes, when they focused on you, were remarkably intense and thoughtful. He was already a respected physicist, though not yet famous. Together with his brother Jacques, he had discovered piezoelectricity, the property of certain crystals to generate electric charge when subjected to mechanical stress. This discovery had important practical applications and had earned the Curie brothers recognition in scientific circles. Pierre had also conducted significant research on crystallography and on magnetism, work that demonstrated both experimental skill and theoretical insight. But despite these achievements, Pierre's career had not followed a conventional path. He had been educated at home by his father, a physician who believed in nurturing his son's natural curiosity rather than forcing them through the rigid structures of formal schooling. Pierre had never attended the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, the traditional route for French scientists. He had earned his degrees through the Sorbonne, yes, but he had remained somewhat outside the establishment, working in a small industrial school rather than at a major research university. This outsider status was partly by choice. Pierre was deeply idealistic about science. He believed that research should be pursued for its own sake, for the advancement of knowledge and human understanding, not for commercial gain or personal advancement. He was indifferent to honors and recognition, cared nothing for academic politics, and had turned down opportunities that would have brought him more prestigious positions but would also have required him to compromise his ideals or spend time on administrative duties rather than research. He was also deeply lonely. He had devoted himself to science with such single-minded intensity that he had formed few close personal relationships. He lived with his parents, who provided a comfortable home environment while making few demands on his time. He spent his days in the laboratory, his evenings reading scientific literature or conducting experiments, his nights contemplating the problems that fascinated him. He had loved once, several years before meeting Marie. He had asked the woman to marry him, but she had refused, and he had never quite recovered from the rejection. He had convinced himself that he would remain unmarried, that his life would be devoted entirely to science, that human connection of the intimate sort was not meant for him. When Pierre met Marie in the crowded workroom where he conducted his research, he was struck immediately by her seriousness and intelligence. She had come to discuss her project on magnetic properties of steel, and she spoke about the work with precision and passion. She asked insightful questions. She grasped complex concepts quickly. Her French, though accented, was clear and technically precise. They spoke for longer than necessary for a simple laboratory arrangement. Pierre found himself interested not just in her research question, but in the story of how this Polish woman had come to Paris to study physics, in her perspectives on various scientific problems. He offered her workspace in his laboratory, access to equipment, and in subsequent visits his assistance and advice on her research. Marie began working in Pierre's laboratory, and they fell into a pattern of collaboration. She would work on her measurements of magnetic properties, and he would sometimes look over her shoulder, making suggestions, discussing methodology. They would talk about physics, about recent discoveries, about the questions that most intrigued them. Marie found herself looking forward to these interactions. Pierre treated her as an intellectual equal, something that was rare in her experience. He listened to her ideas with respect, challenged her thinking in ways that sharpened her understanding, shared his own work with an openness that suggested he valued her opinion. For Pierre, these encounters were increasingly charged with emotion. He was falling in love, and he recognized it with a mixture of wonder and fear. Marie was different from anyone he had known. She was brilliant, yes, but also determined in a way that suggested an almost heroic strength of character. She had overcome obstacles he could barely imagine. She possessed a quality of absolute sincerity, an inability to be false or manipulative, that he found profoundly attractive. As summer approached and Marie's research project neared completion, Pierre realized with dismay that she was planning to return to Poland. She spoke of it matter-of-factly. Her time in Paris was ending. She had accomplished what she had come to do. Her father was aging, and she wished to be near him. She had already stayed away from Poland longer than she had initially intended. Pierre asked her to reconsider. He made the request tentatively at first. Professionally, there was more research she could do, more opportunities in Paris. But as Marie continued to make her preparations to leave, Pierre's requests became more personal, more urgent. He spoke of his feelings for her. He asked her to stay, not just in Paris, but in his life. Marie was surprised and troubled by this declaration. She had not come to Paris seeking romance. Her experience with Kazimierz Żurawski had left her wary of love and the pain it could bring. She had built her life around learning, around the pursuit of knowledge, and she was uncertain about allowing anything to divert her from that path. Moreover, staying in Paris would mean a permanent separation from Poland, from her father, from the country she loved despite its current occupation and oppression. She felt a duty to return, to use her education in service of her homeland. Polish women who gained advanced degrees were expected to come home, to teach, to contribute to the preservation and advancement of Polish culture and learning. She told Pierre that she needed time to think. She left Paris in the summer of 1894 and returned to Warsaw, uncertain about her future, pulled in different directions by competing loyalties and desires. Pierre did not give up. He wrote to her, letters that were remarkable in their combination of scientific discussion and personal feeling. He wrote about his research, yes, but also about his vision for their life together. He painted a picture of a partnership in which they would pursue science side by side, supporting each other's work, united in their dedication to discovery. He acknowledged her concerns about leaving Poland, but argued that the cause of human knowledge transcended national boundaries, that the work they might do together would ultimately benefit all humanity, including Poland. He wrote, "It would be a beautiful thing, in which I hardly dare believe, to pass through life together hypnotized in our dreams. Your dream for your country, our dream for humanity, our dream for science." These letters moved Marie deeply. Pierre was offering something she had never imagined possible, a life in which she would not have to choose between love and science, in which marriage would not mean the end of her intellectual ambitions, but rather their fulfillment and expansion. Yet she hesitated. In Warsaw, she reconnected with family and old friends. She explored possibilities for teaching positions. She tried to imagine a future in Poland, using her education to support the underground movement for Polish education and culture. It was a worthy path, one that aligned with her national loyalty and her desire to honor her parents' sacrifices. But increasingly, she found herself thinking of Paris, of the laboratories and libraries, of the conversation with Pierre that ranged across physics and philosophy and dreams. She thought of how he looked at her with respect and admiration, how he valued her mind as much as anything else about her, how he offered a partnership rather than a conventional marriage in which she would be expected to subordinate her interests to his. The letters from Pierre continued to arrive, patient and persistent and increasingly necessary to her. She began to understand that something fundamental had shifted in her, that her time in Paris had changed her in ways that made a return to her old life impossible. In the autumn of 1894, Marie made her decision. She wrote to Pierre telling him that she would return to Paris. It was not yet an acceptance of his marriage proposal. She was still uncertain about that final commitment, but it was an acknowledgement that her future lay in France, with him, in the pursuit of science. She traveled back to Paris in the fall, and Pierre was there to meet her. They resumed their conversations, their collaboration, their gradually deepening relationship. Pierre continued to press the question of marriage. He brought Marie to meet his parents, who welcomed her warmly, despite the irregularity of their son bringing home a foreign woman of no fortune. Dr. Eugène Curie, Pierre's father, was particularly charmed by Marie's intelligence and seriousness. Finally, in the spring of 1895, Marie agreed to marry Pierre. The wedding was planned for July, and it would be a simple affair, in keeping with both their natures and their limited financial resources. Marie's father and her sister Helena traveled from Warsaw for the occasion. They arrived to find Marie living in modest circumstances, but radiantly happy in a way that she had never been before. The wedding took place on the 26th of July, 1895, at the town hall in Chaux, the suburb where Pierre's parents lived. There was no white dress Marie chose. Instead, a practical dark blue outfit that she could wear again for laboratory work. There was no religious ceremony. Neither Pierre nor Marie were believers, and they preferred a civil union. There was no elaborate celebration, just a simple lunch with family and a few close friends. For their honeymoon, they went on a bicycle tour through the French countryside. Pierre had given Marie a bicycle as a wedding gift, and they rode together through Brittany and the Loire Valley, sleeping in small inns, eating at village restaurants, spending their days in motion through green landscapes and their evenings discussing physics and their future. It was a perfect honeymoon for them, active, simple, focused on their companionship rather than luxury or display. They returned to Paris sunburned and happy, ready to begin their life together. They moved into a small apartment on the Rue de la Glacière, a modest space that they furnished simply. Marie took charge of the household management with the same efficiency she brought to everything, organizing their domestic life in a way that minimized the time and attention it required so that they could both focus on their work. She cooked simple, nutritious meals, kept the apartment clean but not a labor, elegantly decorated, managed their limited budget with care. She had no interest in the elaborate social rituals that occupied many women of her time, the calling cards and formal visits, the attention to fashion and household display. She and Pierre lived quietly, seeing few people outside their scientific circles, content in their partnership. Pierre had hoped that his marriage would bring Marie fully into the French scientific community, that she would find a position at the Sorbonne or another institution. But opportunities for women in science remained scarce. Marie took and passed the aggregation examination, which qualified her to teach at the secondary school level. This provided some income and gave her a professional identity, but it was not the research position she had hoped for. Still, she found ways to pursue science. She began working toward a doctorate, the highest academic degree, which would require original research and a dissertation. But the question remained, research on what? What problem should she tackle for her doctoral work? In December 1895, just months after her marriage, news arrived from Germany that would eventually answer that question and transform both her life and the entire field of physics. Wilhelm Röntgen, a German physicist, had discovered a new kind of radiation. He had been experimenting with cathode ray tubes, glass tubes from which most of the air had been evacuated and through which electric current was passed. He noticed that even when the tube was covered with black cardboard, a fluorescent screen nearby would glow. Something was escaping the tube, some kind of ray that could pass through the cardboard and cause the screen to luminesce. Röntgen called these mysterious emissions X-rays, X for unknown. He discovered that they could pass through many materials, including human tissue, though they were blocked by denser materials like bone and metal. He created photographs showing the bones in his wife's hand, images that seemed miraculous and slightly eerie the living skeleton made visible. The discovery caused a sensation. X-rays captured the public imagination in a way that few scientific discoveries had. Newspapers ran dramatic stories about the new rays. Scientists around the world rushed to replicate Röntgen's experiments and investigate the properties of this mysterious radiation. In Paris, the physicist Henri Becquerel read about Röntgen's discovery with great interest. Becquerel came from a family of scientists. Both his father and grandfather had been distinguished physicists, and he had inherited not only their interest in science, but also access to their laboratory equipment and materials. He was particularly interested in the question of whether X-rays were somehow connected to fluorescence, the property of certain materials to glow when exposed to light. Becquerel began experimenting with uranium salts, which were known to be fluorescent. He would expose these salts to sunlight, causing them to fluoresce, then place them on photographic plates wrapped in black paper to see if they emitted X-rays that would expose the plates. Initially, his experiments seemed to confirm his hypothesis the plates were indeed exposed after being near the fluorescing uranium salts. But then came a crucial accident. In late February 1896, the weather in Paris was cloudy. Becquerel had prepared his uranium salts and his wrapped photographic plates, but without sunlight he could not make the salts fluoresce. He placed the materials in a drawer to wait for better weather. Days passed, still cloudy. Finally, for reasons he later described as pure chance, he decided to develop the photographic plates anyway, expecting them to show only faint exposure, since the uranium had not been activated by sunlight. Instead, the plates showed strong, clear exposure. Something about the uranium salts was affecting the plates, even in complete darkness, even without any fluorescence. Becquerel had discovered that uranium emitted rays spontaneously, without any external stimulus. This was something fundamentally different from X-rays, though the exact nature of these new rays was unclear. Becquerel published his findings, but the response from the scientific community was muted. X-rays were exciting, useful, clearly important, but these uranium rays seemed like a minor curiosity. a strange property of a single element that might or might not be of broader significance. Most scientists moved on to other questions, but Marie Curie, searching for a topic for her doctoral research, saw opportunity in Becquerel's uranium rays. Here was a newly discovered phenomenon that was largely unstudied. Here was a mystery that needed investigation. It seemed like perfect material for a dissertation important enough to be worthwhile, but not so crowded with researchers that she would be competing with established scientists for priority. In early 1897, Marie decided to make Becquerel's rays the subject of her doctoral research. It was a decision that would lead her into uncharted territory, toward discoveries that would redefine physics and claim her health, her husband, and ultimately her life, even as it brought her fame and recognition beyond anything she could have imagined. Part 4. The Discovery. Marie began her investigation of uranium rays in a storage room that Pierre had secured for her at the Municipal School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry, where he worked. To call it a laboratory would be generous. It was really more of a converted shed, a space on the ground floor that was cold, damp, and poorly ventilated. The windows were grimy and let in little light. The floor was concrete. When it rained, water would sometimes seep in. In winter, the temperature inside was barely higher than outside. In summer, the heat was stifling, and the lack of ventilation made the air thick and oppressive. But it was a space, and it was hers. Marie set up her equipment, an electrometer that Pierre and Jacques Curie had invented for measuring electrical charge, various samples of uranium compounds, and other apparatus needed for her experiments. She worked systematically, with the careful methodology that characterized all her research. Her first task was to measure the intensity of rays emitted by uranium compounds more precisely than Becquerel had done. She used Pierre's electrometer to measure the electrical conductivity of air exposed to uranium radiation. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. The rays from uranium had the property of ionizing air, making it able to conduct electricity. By measuring how much more conductive the air became when exposed to uranium, she could quantify the intensity of the radiation. Marie tested various uranium compounds, measuring their emissions carefully, recording her results in laboratory notebooks with precise handwriting. She discovered something important. The intensity of radiation from any uranium compound depended only on the amount of uranium present, not on the chemical form of the compound. Whether the uranium was in the form of oxide or chloride or any other compound made no difference. Only the quantity of uranium mattered. This was a crucial observation. It suggested that the rays were not a product of chemical reactions or molecular structure, but rather a property of the uranium atoms themselves. The radiation, whatever it was, seemed to be atomic in origin. Encouraged by this finding, Marie decided to test other elements to see if any besides uranium emitted similar rays. She obtained samples of various minerals and elements and tested them systematically. Most showed no unusual activity. But then she tested thorium, and to her excitement, she found that it too emitted rays similar to those from uranium. Here was another radioactive element. She had begun using that term, radioactive, to describe the property of emitting these mysterious rays. Thorium's radioactivity seemed to follow the same pattern as uranium's. The intensity depended only on the amount of thorium present, suggesting an atomic origin for the phenomenon. This discovery that radioactivity was not unique to uranium, but was a property shared by at least two elements, was important. It suggested that radioactivity might be more widespread in nature than anyone had suspected, and it implied that there was something fundamental about certain atomic configurations that produced this spontaneous emission of energy. By this point, Pierre was becoming increasingly interested in Marie's work. He would stop by her makeshift laboratory, ask about her progress, discuss her findings. The work was producing genuinely novel results, and Pierre recognized that Marie had identified a phenomenon of real significance. In the spring of 1898, he made a momentous decision. He would set aside his own research projects and work with Marie on the investigation of radioactivity. This was an extraordinary gesture. Pierre was already an established scientist with his own research program. He was giving up his independent work to collaborate with his wife on her doctoral project. It was a testament to both his recognition of the importance of the work and his commitment to their partnership. Together, Marie and Pierre began testing a wide variety of substances, looking for radioactivity. They tested pure elements, chemical compounds, minerals from various sources. Most showed no activity. But then they tested pitchblende, a uranium ore, and discovered something astonishing. Pitchblende was more radioactive than pure uranium, much more radioactive. According to Marie's measurements, pitchblende emitted radiation several times more intense than could be accounted for by its uranium content. The numbers didn't make sense unless pitchblende contained some other element, something much more radioactive than uranium, something present in tiny quantities but emitting powerful radiation. Marie and Pierre looked at the data and then at each other. The implication was clear. There might be an undiscovered element in pitchblende, an element with radioactive properties far exceeding those of uranium or thorium. It was an audacious hypothesis. Elements were not discovered frequently. The periodic table was mostly filled in, and finding a genuinely new element was rare and significant. To propose not just one, but possibly multiple new elements based on an anomaly in radiation measurements required considerable confidence. But Marie and Pierre trusted their data. They had checked and rechecked their measurements. They had tested multiple samples of pitchblende from different sources. The results were consistent. Pitchblende was too radioactive to be explained by its known composition. They decided to attempt chemical separation of the pitchblende to isolate whatever mysterious substance was producing the excess radiation. This was a monumental task. If the radioactive element was present in tiny quantities, they would need to process large amounts of ore to obtain even the smallest sample. Moreover, they would be working without a clear guide. They didn't know the chemical properties of the element they were seeking because they didn't know what element it was. They began the work in the spring of 1898. They obtained pitchblende residue, the waste material left after uranium had been extracted from pitchblende ore for commercial use. This residue should contain little uranium, but, according to their hypothesis, should still contain the mysterious radioactive element they were seeking. A mining company in Austria provided them with several sacks of the material at minimal cost, since it was considered worthless waste. The sacks of pitchblende residue arrived at the municipal school and were piled in a shed near Marie's laboratory. The material was coarse and dusty, a brownish mixture that looked more like something to be discarded than the source of scientific discovery. Marie and Pierre began the laborious process of chemical separation. They would dissolve batches of the pitchblende in acid, then use various chemical techniques to separate the dissolved material into fractions. After each separation step, they would test each fraction for radioactivity, following the trail of radiation to determine which fraction contained the mysterious element. It was exhausting, repetitive work. They would spend hours boiling solutions, filtering precipitates, transferring liquids from one container to another. The process would be repeated many times, each iteration purifying the radioactive fraction a little more, concentrating the unknown element. The conditions were punishing. The shed they were using larger than Marie's original laboratory, but no more comfortable, was hot in summer and freezing in winter. The ventilation was poor, and the fumes from their chemical processes filled the air. They worked with corrosive acids and other dangerous substances, with minimal safety precautions by modern standards. Marie would stir boiling pots of pitchblende residue with an iron rod nearly as tall as she was, her arms aching from the effort. The process required physical strength and endurance as much as scientific knowledge. She would return home in the evenings, exhausted and stained with chemicals, her hands roughened and sometimes burned by the acids. By July 1898, they had succeeded in isolating a fraction that was significantly more radioactive than uranium, about 400 times more radioactive. This fraction had chemical properties similar to bismuth, but it was clearly not pure bismuth because of its intense radioactivity. They concluded that they had isolated a new element, chemically similar to bismuth but radioactively distinct. Marie chose the name for this new element, polonium, after her beloved Poland. It was a gesture of patriotic feeling, a way to honor her homeland even in a French laboratory. Poland did not appear on contemporary political maps. It existed only in the hearts of Poles and in the clandestine efforts to preserve Polish culture. Now it would appear on the periodic table, a declaration that Poland existed and mattered. Pierre and Marie published their findings in July 1898, announcing the discovery of polonium. The paper was modest in tone, but bold in its claims. They had found a new element, they asserted, identifiable by its intense radioactivity. They acknowledged that they had not yet isolated it in pure form, that work would continue, but they were confident in their conclusions. The scientific community reacted with interest, but also skepticism. The evidence was persuasive. But the Curies had not yet produced a pure sample of polonium, or determined its atomic weight, the traditional criteria for confirming a new element. More work would be needed to satisfy the skeptics. Marie and Pierre returned to their processing of pitchblende. As they worked through more material, they discovered that even after removing the bismuth-like fraction that contained polonium, the remaining residue still showed radioactivity. Something else was in the pitchblende, another unknown radioactive element. They continued their chemical separations, following this second trail of radioactivity. This new element appeared to have chemical properties similar to barium. They worked through the summer and fall of 1898, processing batch after batch of pitchblende, gradually concentrating the radioactive fractions. By December, they had accumulated enough evidence to announce a second new element. This one they named radium, from the Latin word for ray. The name was appropriate. Radium proved to be extraordinarily radioactive, even more so than polonium. A tiny amount of radium emitted radiation that could be detected easily, that would cause fluorescent materials to glow visibly in the dark. The announcement of radium, published in December 1898, created more excitement than polonium had. Two new elements discovered in the same year, both identified primarily by their radioactive properties. It was an extraordinary achievement. But again, the skeptics noted that the Curies had not yet isolated pure radium or determined its atomic weight. The work was promising, but it was not yet complete. Marie and Pierre understood this. They knew that to convince the scientific community fully, they would need to produce pure radium and measure its atomic weight precisely. This became the focus of their work over the next years, the isolation of radium in pure form. It was an almost impossible task. Radium was present in pitchblende in infinitesimally small quantities. To obtain even a tiny sample of pure radium would require processing tons of pitchblende residue. The chemical separations would need to be repeated thousands of times. It would take years of grueling work. They obtained more pitchblende residue from the Austrian mines. Sacks and sacks of the material arrived, until the shed was filled with it. The Austrian government and the mining company, recognizing the scientific importance of the work, provided the material at low cost, but transportation and handling of such quantities was still expensive. The Curies paid for much of it out of their own pockets, which remained modest despite their growing scientific reputation. Through 1,899 and 1,900 and into 1,901, Marie and Pierre worked on the purification of radium. It became the central focus of their lives, a project that consumed nearly all their time and energy. Marie in particular drove the work forward with relentless determination. She processed batch after batch of pitchblende, performing the same chemical operations again and again, gradually accumulating small quantities of increasingly pure radium compounds. The work required immense patience and physical endurance. Marie would work in the shed for hours at a time, stirring boiling solutions, manipulating heavy containers, breathing fumes that made her cough. She would track the radioactivity of each fraction with careful measurements, making decisions about which fractions to combine, which to process further, which to set aside. Pierre worked on the physics of radioactivity, investigating the properties of the radiation itself. He discovered that radium emitted heat continuously, a finding that had profound implications. Where was this energy coming from? Radium could emit heat indefinitely without any apparent source of fuel, without any chemical reaction. It seemed to violate the principle of conservation of energy, one of the fundamental laws of physics. This observation pushed the Curies toward a radical conclusion. Radioactivity must involve some kind of transformation of the atoms themselves. The energy must be coming from within the atom, from some previously unknown atomic process. This was a revolutionary idea. Atoms were supposed to be indivisible and unchanging, the fundamental building blocks of matter. But radioactivity suggested that atoms of radioactive elements were not stable, that they were spontaneously transforming into something else, releasing energy in the process. The Curies published papers describing their findings, contributing to a growing body of work on radioactivity. Other scientists were now interested in the phenomenon. Ernest Rutherford and Frederick Soddy in Canada were investigating thorium and had reached similar conclusions about atomic transformation. The field of radioactivity was becoming active and competitive. But the Curies maintained their focus on the isolation of pure radium, the work that would definitively prove the existence of their new element. By 1902, Marie had processed literally tons of pitch-blende residue. The shed where they worked was piled with sacks of raw material, containers of solutions at various stages of processing, and equipment covered in chemical stains. It looked more like an industrial facility than a scientific laboratory. And in some ways, that's what it was. Marie had become as much a chemical engineer as a physicist, developing techniques for large-scale processing of ore. Finally, after years of work, Marie succeeded in producing a tiny sample of pure radium chloride, about 1/10 of a gram. It was barely visible, a few small crystals, but it was pure. She measured its atomic weight, 5 close to the modern value of 226. She had her pure element, her atomic weight, the proof that radium was real. The sample glowed faintly in the dark, emitting a ghostly blue-green light from its intense radioactivity. Marie and Pierre would sometimes go to the shed at night to see their radium samples glowing in the darkness like mysterious lanterns. The sight filled them with wonder and satisfaction, the visible evidence of their discovery, the light literally produced by atomic transformation. In 1903, Marie submitted her doctoral dissertation, Recherches sur les substances radioactives, research on radioactive substances. It was a comprehensive work, describing her systematic investigation of radioactivity, the discovery of polonium and radium, the methods used to isolate radium, and the properties of radioactive materials. It represented 4 years of intensive work and constituted one of the most important scientific contributions of the era. Her dissertation defense took place in June 1903 at the Sorbonne. It was an unusual event. Women had received doctorates in France before, but it was still rare enough to attract attention. The examination room was crowded with scientists, colleagues, friends, and the simply curious. Marie's father traveled from Warsaw to witness this triumph. He sat in the audience with tears in his eyes, watching his youngest daughter, who had once been a penniless governess in Poland, defend revolutionary scientific work before the leading physicists of France. The defense was successful, of course. The examiners asked questions. Marie answered them clearly and confidently, and the degree was awarded. Marie Skłodowska-Curie became Doctor ès Sciences Physiques, the first woman in France to earn a doctorate in physics. It should have been a moment of unalloyed celebration, but Pierre fell ill shortly after, suffering from unexplained pains and exhaustion that would recur throughout the remaining years of his life. The years of working with radioactive materials, of handling substances that emitted constant radiation, were beginning to take their toll on both their bodies, though they did not yet fully understand the danger. Still, in the summer of 1903, they had reason for satisfaction. They had discovered 2 new elements, had opened up a new field of physics, and had earned scientific recognition for their achievements. The work had been hard, harder than either had anticipated, but they had persevered and succeeded. They had done it together, as partners, just as Pierre had envisioned when he had written to Marie in Warsaw years before, proposing a life united in the pursuit of science. The world was beginning to take notice. In November 1903, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences announced that the Nobel Prize in Physics would be awarded jointly to Henri Becquerel, Pierre Curie, and Marie Curie for their work on radioactivity. It was the highest honor in science, and Marie Curie was the first woman to receive it. Part 5. Recognition and Loss. The news of the Nobel Prize arrived while Marie and Pierre were teaching. A telegram was delivered, official and formal, informing them of the Swedish Academy's decision. They read it with a mixture of pleasure and trepidation. The recognition was gratifying, of course, but they understood that it would bring unwanted attention and disruption to their carefully guarded privacy. They were right to be concerned. Almost immediately, their lives were invaded by public interest. Journalists appeared at their door, wanting interviews, photographs, human interest stories about the woman scientist and her husband. The French press seized upon Marie as a novelty, a female Nobel laureate. How extraordinary! The stories focused as much on her appearance and domestic life as on her scientific work, a pattern that would frustrate her throughout her public life. The Curies tried to maintain their normal routines, but it became increasingly difficult. They were invited to social events, asked to give public lectures, solicited for endorsements and commercial ventures. Companies wanted to use their names to sell products. Society hostesses wanted them at their gatherings as curiosities to display to guests. Pierre found this attention particularly burdensome. He was a private man who had always avoided publicity, and he reacted to fame with dismay. He and Marie discussed how to handle it. They agreed to refuse most invitations, to decline interviews whenever possible, to protect their time for research and teaching. They did not immediately travel to Stockholm to receive the prize. Pierre was ill, suffering from the mysterious pains and exhaustion that had begun afflicting him. The Swedish Academy had initially planned to award the prize only to Becquerel and Pierre, omitting Marie despite her central role in the discovery of polonium and radium. It was only after Pierre learned of this plan and insisted that Marie's contribution was equal to his own that the Academy added her name to the award. This near exclusion was a stark reminder of the barriers that women in science still faced. Even revolutionary work could be overlooked or attributed solely to male colleagues. It would not be the last time Marie would have to fight for recognition of her achievements. In 1905, Pierre and Marie finally made the journey to Stockholm to deliver their Nobel lecture. Pierre spoke for both of them, describing their work on radioactive substances. He spoke with characteristic modesty, emphasizing the collaborative nature of their research, crediting Marie's contributions explicitly. He also spoke with prescience about the potential dangers of radioactive materials, noting that they could be harmful in the wrong hands, even as he affirmed his belief that scientific knowledge ultimately benefited humanity. The Nobel Prize came with a monetary award of 70,000 francs, a substantial sum that dramatically improved the Curie's financial situation. They used some of the money to help family members and struggling students. They also installed a modern bathroom in their house, their first, a luxury that Marie particularly appreciated after years of Spartan living. More importantly, the Nobel Prize brought Pierre a professorship at the Sorbonne. In 1904, the University of Paris created a chair of physics for him, finally bringing him into the academic establishment he had long remained outside of. The position came with a laboratory and an assistant position for Marie, though she was not appointed as faculty herself, despite her equal contributions to the prize-winning research. During these years, Marie and Pierre also became parents. Their daughter Irène had been born in September 1897 during the early stages of their radioactivity research. The pregnancy and birth had been difficult for Marie, who was unused to being physically limited and who tried to continue her laboratory work for as long as possible. The infant Irène was colicky and demanding, and Marie struggled with the competing demands of motherhood and research, but she managed, as she managed everything, through determination and organization. She hired help for childcare, enabling her to continue her work. She nursed Irène while reading scientific papers. She recorded Irène's development in a notebook with the same systematic approach she brought to laboratory research, tracking the child's weight, first words, developmental milestones. In December 1904, a second daughter, Ève, was born. Ève was a healthier, easier baby than Irène had been, and Marie was by now more experienced with balancing motherhood and science. The household settled into a rhythm, busy but functional, centered around work and family. Pierre's new laboratory at the Sorbonne was a significant improvement over the shed where they had isolated radium, though it was still far from ideal. They could continue their research with better equipment and more space. Marie worked as Pierre's chief assistant, though in practice they remained equal partners in their investigations. They continued to study radioactivity, investigating its properties, exploring its potential applications. The field was expanding rapidly. Radioactive materials were being tested for medical applications. Radiation seemed to kill diseased cells and was being explored as a treatment for cancer and other conditions. Industries were becoming interested in radioactive materials for various purposes. The scientific and practical implications of the Curie's discoveries were manifesting in unexpected ways. But even as their work was achieving recognition and their lives were stabilizing, Pierre's health was deteriorating. He suffered from increasing pain in his legs and back. He was often exhausted, unable to work with his former energy. He had difficulty sleeping. Marie, too, suffered from various ailments, fatigue, pains in her hands and arms, occasional mysterious fevers. Neither of them connected these symptoms to their work with radioactive materials. The dangers of radiation were not yet well understood. They had handled radioactive substances for years, carrying test tubes of radium in their pockets, working with solutions that glowed from radioactivity, breathing air contaminated with radioactive dust. The long-term consequences of this exposure would not become clear for many years, and by then it would be too late to undo the damage. In the spring of 1906, Pierre seemed to be feeling somewhat better. He and Marie were planning future research. They discussed taking a family vacation that summer, perhaps a bicycle tour as they had done in the early days of their marriage. They were looking forward to spring, to warmer weather, to the possibility of easier days ahead. On the 19th of April, 1906, a rainy Thursday, Pierre went out to attend a meeting of the Association of Professors of the Faculty of Science. It was a routine obligation, the kind of faculty business that he usually found tedious, but accepted as part of his responsibilities. After the meeting, he ran some errands in the city. The rain was falling steadily, making the streets slick and the visibility poor. Pierre, abstracted as always, his mind, likely on scientific problems rather than his surroundings, was crossing the Rue Dauphine behind the Panthéon. He stepped between two stationary horse-drawn cabs and into the street. He did not see the heavy wagon approaching, pulled by two horses at a trot. The driver shouted a warning, but Pierre, perhaps lost in thought, perhaps simply unable to react quickly enough, did not get out of the way in time. He fell, or was knocked down directly into the path of the wagon. The driver tried to stop, pulling desperately on the reins, but the horses could not halt on the wet pavement. The front wheels of the wagon missed Pierre's body, but the rear left wheel passed over his head. The skull was fractured. Death was instantaneous. A crowd gathered quickly. The police were summoned. Pierre's body was carried to a nearby police station. Papers in his pockets identified him, and the police sent word to the Sorbonne. Marie was in her laboratory when she received the news. Someone came to tell her that Pierre had been in an accident, that she should come quickly. She left immediately, not yet understanding, perhaps hoping it was not serious. When she learned that Pierre was dead, she did not cry out or collapse. She stood very still, very quiet, her face becoming pale and rigid. She asked to see him. They had taken his body to the house in Sceaux where Pierre's parents lived, and Marie went there. She saw him one final time. His head was bandaged, hiding the terrible wound. She stood beside the body for a long time, silent and tearless. Those who witnessed her grief were struck by its controlled intensity, the sense of someone suffering profoundly but containing it all within. The funeral took place on April 21, just 2 days after the accident. It was a simple ceremony, as Pierre would have wanted. He was buried in Sceaux, in the family plot. The weather was beautiful, ironically spring sunshine and flowering trees. A lovely day that seemed to mock the tragedy of the occasion. Dignitaries from the scientific community attended, colleagues and students, family, and a few friends. Marie stood at the graveside, still tearless, still rigid with suppressed grief. She held a few wild flowers that she had gathered that morning, and when the time came, she placed them carefully on the coffin. After the ceremony, after the mourners had left, Marie returned to the house in Sceaux. She went to the room where Pierre's body had lain before the funeral, and there, alone, she finally wept. She wept for hours, releasing the grief she had held in during the public moments, crying until she was exhausted and empty. In the days and weeks that followed, Marie existed in a state of numb shock. She moved through the necessary tasks of daily life mechanically. She cared for her daughters, though she seemed emotionally distant even from them. She began keeping a journal, a practice she had never maintained before, and in its pages she wrote to Pierre as if he could still hear her, pouring out her grief and loneliness, her sense that life had lost its purpose and meaning. "They filled your grave and put flowers on it," she wrote. "They have brought you into the room and have laid you in your coffin. I have seen you. Your coffin was closed yesterday evening, and I could no longer see you. I have no longer the right to see you. Pierre, I got up after having slept rather well, relatively calm. That was barely a quarter of an hour ago, and now I want to howl again like a wild beast." The scientific community mourned Pierre as a great loss. He had been at the height of his powers, with undoubtedly many discoveries yet to make. Tributes and condolences poured in from around the world. But for Marie, these formal expressions of sympathy meant little. She had lost not just a colleague, but her partner, the person who had understood her completely, who had shared her dreams and her dedication to science, who had made it possible for her to pursue her work while also finding personal happiness. The question of what she would do now pressed upon her. The Sorbonne offered her Pierre's position and his laboratory. She would become the first woman to hold a professorship at the University of Paris, teaching the courses Pierre had been scheduled to teach. Marie accepted. She would continue the work they had begun together. It was what Pierre would have wanted, and more than that, it was what she needed. The work, the research, the pursuit of knowledge, these had defined her life before Pierre and would continue to define it after his death. Science offered something to hold on to when everything else had been swept away. Her first lecture at the Sorbonne was scheduled for November 1906. There was tremendous public interest. The widow of Pierre Curie, the woman Nobel laureate, would give her first lecture. The hall was packed with scientists, students, journalists, and curious members of the public, all eager to see how Marie would handle this moment. She entered the lecture hall precisely on time, dressed in black, her face pale and composed. The audience waited to see if she would speak about Pierre, offer some memorial tribute. Instead, she walked to the lecture bench and began speaking exactly where Pierre's final lecture had ended, as if taking up a sentence he had left incomplete. When one considers the progress that has been made in physics in the past 10 years, she began, and continued into the material of the day's lesson. There was no personal preamble, no acknowledgement of the extraordinary circumstances. She simply taught physics, as she had been hired to do, delivering the lecture with clarity and precision. It was a remarkable performance, a statement about how Marie intended to proceed. She would honor Pierre's memory not through sentiment, but through continuing their work with the same rigor and dedication they had always brought to it. The personal and the professional would remain separate, her private grief contained so that her public work could continue. Part 6. The Second Prize and Scandal. In the years following Pierre's death, Marie threw herself into work with an intensity that alarmed those who cared about her. She maintained a punishing schedule, teaching at the Sorbonne, conducting research, supervising students, all while raising 2 young daughters. She slept little, ate irregularly, and seemed to be deliberately exhausting herself, as if constant activity could hold grief at bay. She continued the research on radium that she and Pierre had begun. She worked to purify more radium, to determine its properties more precisely, to establish it unequivocally in the scientific record. She published a massive treatise on radioactivity in 1910, a comprehensive work that synthesized years of research and established her as the leading authority on the subject. She also fought for recognition and resources. As a woman in a male-dominated field, she faced skepticism and dismissal that her male colleagues did not encounter. When she applied for membership in the French Academy of Sciences in 1911, she was rejected. The Academy had never admitted a woman and was not prepared to start, even for a Nobel laureate. The rejection was a public humiliation, though Marie accepted it with outward stoicism. But international recognition continued to grow. The scientific community beyond France increasingly acknowledged Marie's achievements. In 1911, the Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded her a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for her isolation of pure radium and her determination of its atomic weight. She became the first person ever to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different scientific fields, an achievement that remains rare to this day. This second prize was awarded to Marie alone, not shared with collaborators. It was recognition specifically of her work, her contributions, her scientific achievement. It should have been a triumph, a validation of her persistence in the face of loss and discrimination. Instead, it coincided with a scandal that nearly destroyed her reputation and career. In 1910, Marie had met Paul Langevin, a former student of Pierre's who had become a distinguished physicist in his own right. Langevin was married, but unhappy in his marriage. He and his wife were temperamentally mismatched, and their relationship had deteriorated into open hostility. Langevin and Marie began to spend time together, drawn by shared scientific interests and, gradually, by deeper feelings. A relationship developed between them. The exact nature of that relationship has been debated by historians, certainly an emotional intimacy, possibly a physical affair. Marie, who had been alone since Pierre's death, found in Langevin someone who could understand her work, who could speak to her as an intellectual equal, who offered companionship and affection. But the relationship became known. Langevin's wife, Jeanne, discovered letters that Marie had written to Paul. These letters suggested romantic feelings, affection beyond mere collegiality. Jean Langevin, furious and seeking revenge, gave copies of the letters to the press. In November 1911, just as Marie was preparing to travel to Stockholm to receive her second Nobel Prize, the scandal broke. The newspapers published lurid stories about Marie Curie's affair with a married man. They portrayed her as a homewrecker, a foreign woman who had seduced a French husband away from his wife and children. The coverage was vicious and sensationalistic, mixing xenophobia with misogyny in equal measure. The press described Marie as a Polish temptress who had no respect for French domestic values. They called her a husband stealer, morally corrupt, unworthy of her position at the Sorbonne. Some newspapers published the stolen letters, private correspondence that had never been intended for public consumption, dissecting her words for evidence of impropriety. The scandal consumed Paris. Crowds gathered outside Marie's house, shouting insults and throwing stones. The windows were broken. Marie and her daughters, Irene now 14, Eve 7, had to flee, taking refuge with friends while the fury raged outside. Some members of the Swedish Academy suggested that Marie should decline the Nobel Prize, that her acceptance would bring scandal to the institution. They sent a letter suggesting that she not come to Stockholm until the personal matters were resolved. Marie's response was defiant. She wrote back that the prize had been awarded for her scientific work, which was entirely separate from her private life. The Academy had no business concerning itself with personal matters. She would come to Stockholm as planned, she would accept the prize, and she would deliver her Nobel lecture as was customary. And she did. In December 1911, Marie traveled to Stockholm accompanied by her sister Bronia and her daughter Irene. She appeared at the ceremony, pale but composed, dressed in black as she had worn since Pierre's death. She accepted the Nobel Prize in Chemistry with dignity, and she delivered a lecture titled Radium and the New Concepts in Chemistry that focused entirely on science. In her lecture, she described the painstaking work of isolating radium, the methods developed, the properties discovered. She spoke of Pierre's contributions, honoring his memory. She made no reference whatsoever to the scandal, offered no defense or explanation. She presented her science and let it speak for itself. It was an act of tremendous courage and self-control to stand before the scientific community while knowing that much of Europe was reading about her private life in newspapers, while her reputation was being shredded in the press. And to speak only of physics and chemistry, it required a strength of character that few could have mustered. She returned to Paris to find that the scandal had not abated. The attacks continued, becoming, if anything, more vicious. Some of her colleagues at the Sorbonne suggested she might want to resign her position, to spare the university further embarrassment. Others, however, stood by her. The physicist Paul Langevin challenged one of the newspaper editors to a duel over the attacks on Marie's character. The duel took place, but ended without injury to either party. The great mathematician Henri Poincaré wrote to the Nobel Committee defending Marie, stating that whatever her private life might be, she had earned the prize through exceptional scientific achievement and deserved to be honored for it. The physicist Ernest Rutherford, working in England, wrote to Marie expressing his support and his contempt for the scandal-mongering press. But the strain took a terrible toll on Marie's health. She suffered a severe kidney infection and spent much of 1912 seriously ill, undergoing surgery, confined to bed for months. Her daughters were sent to stay with family while she recovered. For a time, it seemed possible that she might die, following Pierre into an early grave. She survived, but the recovery was long and difficult. When she finally returned to work in 1913, she was visibly changed, thinner, grayer, more withdrawn. The vivacious young woman who had arrived in Paris in 1891, the passionate scientist who had worked joyfully alongside Pierre, had been replaced by someone harder and more guarded, someone who had learned that public life could be cruel and that achievement offered no protection against personal attack. The scandal gradually faded from public attention. Paul Langevin remained with his wife, though their marriage was permanently damaged. Marie and Langevin maintained a professional relationship, but the romantic connection, whatever it had been, ended. Marie focused on her work and her daughters, building walls around her private life that she would maintain for the rest of her days. In 1913, the Radium Institute was established in Paris, a facility dedicated to radioactivity research and to the medical applications of radium. Marie was appointed as director of one of the institute's laboratories. Finally, she would have a proper facility for her research, the kind of well-equipped laboratory she had dreamed of during the years of working in the converted shed. The institute was still under construction when, in August 1914, everything changed. The Great War began. Part 7. War and Radiology. When war broke out across Europe in August 1914, Marie was on vacation with her daughters in Brittany. She received word of the German mobilization and immediately made plans to return to Paris. France was in turmoil. Men were being called up for military service. The government was preparing for invasion. Panic was spreading through the population. Marie's first concern was for the Radium Institute. She had a gram of radium there, a tiny amount by mass, but incredibly valuable, representing years of work in the purification of tons of pitchblende. Radium was rare and precious, and Marie feared that it might be stolen or destroyed in the chaos of war. She arranged to transport the radium to Bordeaux, where the French government was temporarily relocating. She made the journey herself, carrying the lead-lined case containing her radium samples, traveling on trains packed with soldiers heading to the front and civilians fleeing Paris. She delivered the radium to a bank vault in Bordeaux for safekeeping, then returned to Paris. The city was partially evacuated. Many of the scientific community had left, either called to military service or fleeing to safer locations. Marie could have left as well, taken her daughters to safety, but she chose to stay. She began thinking about how she could contribute to the war effort, how her scientific knowledge could serve France in its time of need. She quickly identified a critical need: X-ray equipment at the front. Soldiers were being wounded in unprecedented numbers, and doctors needed to locate bullets and shrapnel to treat injuries effectively. X-ray technology existed, but it was primarily confined to major hospitals and cities, far from the battlefield. Wounded soldiers had to be transported great distances for X-ray examinations, wasting time and causing unnecessary suffering. Marie conceived of a solution: portable X-ray units that could be brought to the battlefield. If X-ray equipment could be installed in vehicles, radiological examinations could be performed at field hospitals near the front lines, allowing for faster, more effective treatment of the wounded. She set about making this vision a reality with characteristic determination. She solicited donations of X-ray equipment and vehicles. She convinced automobile manufacturers to donate cars and vans. She recruited technicians and drivers. She designed systems for installing X-ray equipment in vehicles, working out the technical challenges of making the delicate apparatus function reliably in mobile conditions. She also learned to drive, teaching herself so that she could personally operate these radiological vehicles. At the age of 47, Marie Curie obtained a driver's license and learned to handle the temperamental early automobiles on the rough roads of wartime France. By late 1914, she had equipped her first radiological vehicle, a Renault car containing a Röntgen apparatus, photographic darkroom equipment, and an electricity generator. The vehicle was painted in dull colors and marked with a red cross. It became known as a Petite Curie, a little Curie car. Marie drove this vehicle herself to field hospitals near the front lines. She would arrive at a military hospital, set up the equipment, and begin examining wounded soldiers. Doctors who had never seen an X-ray before watched in amazement as the plates revealed the precise location of bullets embedded in flesh, shrapnel lodged near vital organs, fractures that were invisible to external examination. The X-rays allowed surgeons to operate with far greater precision. They could extract bullets without exploratory cutting, could set fractures properly, could make informed decisions about treatment. The Petite Curies saved countless lives and prevented countless unnecessary amputations and complications. Marie was not content with operating a single vehicle. She organized a fleet of them, eventually equipping 20 mobile radiological units. She also established 200 radiological rooms in field hospitals throughout France, training technicians to operate the equipment, ensuring that X-ray capability was available wherever wounded soldiers needed it. She trained young women as radiological assistants, teaching them the physics of X-rays, the techniques of radiography, the proper handling of equipment. Many of these women had no scientific background, but Marie taught them efficiently, focusing on practical skills while explaining the underlying principles enough that they could troubleshoot problems and work independently. Her daughter, Irene, now 17, became one of her assistants. Together, mother and daughter would travel to the front, setting up X-ray equipment, examining soldiers, working in conditions that were often dangerous and always difficult. They would work for hours at a time in improvised facilities, often under bombardment, sometimes in buildings that had been damaged by shelling. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining. Marie saw the terrible injuries of modern warfare up close, the shattered limbs, the terrible wounds, the young men traumatized by experiences beyond imagination. She maintained her composure, focusing on the technical work, on taking clear X-ray images, on providing the information doctors needed to help these suffering soldiers. She worked without regard for her own safety or health. She was exposed to X-rays constantly, receiving doses of radiation that would be considered dangerous by modern standards. But radiation protection was poorly understood in 1914, and Marie was more concerned with helping the wounded than with her own well-being. Between trips to the front, she continued teaching. She gave classes in radiography to doctors and nurses, spreading knowledge of the technology as widely as possible. She wrote instruction manuals, created training programs, systematized the practice of military radiography. She also dealt with bureaucratic obstacles. Military and medical authorities were not always receptive to this civilian woman telling them how to organize their medical services. Marie had to navigate military hierarchies, convince skeptical officials, secure permissions and resources. She did so with persistence and political skill that she had developed over years of operating in male-dominated institutions. The war years were grueling, but in some ways they provided Marie with a sense of purpose that had been missing since Pierre's death. She was using her knowledge to save lives, contributing directly to France's war effort, working with intensity and focus on problems that had clear, immediate importance. Irene proved to be a capable assistant and an apt pupil. She absorbed her mother's teachings about physics and radiography, developing her own expertise. Working alongside her mother during the war years created a bond between them, a shared experience that would shape the trajectory of Irene's life. She would eventually follow Marie into scientific research and would make her own significant contributions to the study of radioactivity. The war dragged on. 1914 gave way to 1,915, then 1,916, then 1,917. The casualties mounted into the millions. The Petites Curies continued their work, serving an estimated over 1 million wounded soldiers during the course of the conflict. Marie drove thousands of kilometers, performed countless X-ray examinations, trained hundreds of radiological technicians. She maintained this pace even as her own health continued to deteriorate. She suffered from chronic fatigue, recurring fevers, and various other ailments. Her hands, which had handled radioactive materials for 20 years and were now constantly exposed to X-rays, were damaged and painful. Her eyes troubled her, but she continued working, driven by the same determination that had carried her through the isolation of radium in the aftermath of Pierre's death. When the armistice finally came in November 1918, ending the Great War, Marie had spent 4 years in service to France. She had set aside her own research entirely, dedicating herself to practical applications of physics in the service of saving lives. The French government recognized her contributions, though the formal honors were modest compared to her actual achievements. With the war over, Marie returned to the Radium Institute, which had finally been completed during the conflict, but had stood largely unused while she worked at the front. Now, at age 51, exhausted and ill, but still determined, she prepared to resume the research that was her life's work. Part 8. The Institute Years. The Radium Institute on the Rue Pierre Curie in Paris was everything that Marie had longed for during the years of working in inadequate facilities. It had proper laboratories with good ventilation and lighting, modern equipment, space for multiple research projects to proceed simultaneously. It had a garden where researchers could take breaks, breathing fresh air away from the chemical fumes and radioactive materials. Marie took up her position as director of the Curie Laboratory, one of 2 research divisions within the institute. The other division, focused on medical applications of radioactivity, was directed by Dr. Claudius Ragaud. Marie's laboratory would concentrate on fundamental research into radioactivity and chemistry. She set about building a research team, recruiting students and young scientists to work under her direction. She was a demanding director, expecting the same rigor and dedication from her students that she had always demanded from herself. She insisted on careful experimental technique, precise measurements, thorough record-keeping. She had little patience for sloppiness or intellectual laziness, but she was also generous with her knowledge and her time. She would work alongside her students, teaching techniques, discussing problems, sharing insights gained from decades of experience. She created an environment where serious research could flourish, where questions about radioactivity and atomic structure could be pursued systematically. Among her students was Irene, who had decided to pursue a career in science. After working with her mother during the war, Irene enrolled at the Sorbonne and began her own research at the Radium Institute. She would eventually marry Frédéric Joliot, another of Marie's students, and together Irene and Frédéric would continue the family tradition of groundbreaking research in radioactivity, eventually winning their own Nobel Prize. But research required resources, and radium remained scarce and expensive. Despite having discovered radium and developed the processes for extracting it, Marie did not own significant quantities of the element. The radium she had purified before the war had been used up or distributed to other researchers. Industrial production of radium had begun. Companies were now mining pitchblende and extracting radium commercially, but they sold it at prices that were far beyond Marie's budget. An American journalist named Marie Maloney, known as Missy, visited Marie in 1920 and was shocked to discover that the discoverer of radium did not have enough of the element to continue her research effectively. Missy conceived of a plan to help. She would organize a fundraising campaign in the United States to purchase 1 gram of radium for Marie Curie. 1 gram might seem like a tiny amount, but radium was so rare and difficult to produce that a gram was valued at $100,000, an enormous sum in 1920. Missy launched a publicity campaign, writing articles, giving speeches, soliciting donations from wealthy Americans and from the general public. The response was overwhelming. Americans were fascinated by the story of Marie Curie, the brilliant scientist who had overcome poverty and prejudice to make revolutionary discoveries. In 1921, Marie and her daughters traveled to the United States for a triumphant tour. They visited universities and research laboratories. Marie gave lectures and attended ceremonies. Everywhere she went, she was greeted by crowds eager to see the famous Madame Curie. The tour culminated in a ceremony at the White House, where President Warren Harding presented Marie with a small lead-lined case containing 1 gram of radium, purchased with the funds raised by Missy Maloney's campaign. It was a gift from the women of America to Marie Curie, a gesture of international solidarity and recognition. Marie was moved by the generosity, though she found the publicity exhausting. She was not comfortable with public attention, preferred the quiet of the laboratory to the noise of ceremonies and receptions. But she understood the importance of the gift and was genuinely grateful for the support. She returned to Paris with her gram of radium and resumed her research. The 1,920 seconds were productive years for the Radium Institute. Important work was being done on the properties of radioactive elements, on the nature of radioactive decay, on the structure of atoms. Marie supervised this work, contributing her own research while also guiding the next generation of scientists. She also became increasingly concerned with the hazards of radioactivity. By the 1,920 seconds, it was becoming clear that exposure to radioactive materials could cause serious health problems. Cases of radiation poisoning were documented among workers in radium dial factories, where luminous paint containing radium was applied to watch faces and instrument panels. These workers, mostly young women, would lick their brushes to bring them to a fine point, ingesting small amounts of radium in the process. Many developed terrible illnesses, their bones literally disintegrating, their jaws crumbling, their bodies racked with pain. Marie recognized the danger but seemed unable or unwilling to connect it to her own health problems. She had worked with radioactive materials for decades, handling them with minimal protection, breathing air contaminated with radioactive dust, carrying test tubes of radium solutions in her pockets. Her hands were scarred and damaged, her fingertips perpetually inflamed and sometimes bleeding. She suffered from cataracts that impaired her vision. She experienced chronic fatigue and recurrent illnesses. She began to implement some safety measures at the Institute, insisting on better ventilation, encouraging the use of protective equipment. But her own practices remained cavalier by modern standards. She continued to handle radioactive materials directly, continued to work long hours in the laboratory, continued to push herself despite her declining health. In 1929, she made a second trip to the United States, this time to receive funding for radium for the Radium Institute in Warsaw, which had been established in her honor in her homeland. Poland was now independent, having regained its sovereignty after World War I, and Marie felt a renewed connection to her native country. The Warsaw Radium Institute would allow Polish scientists to pursue research in radioactivity, contributing to the scientific development of the nation. President Herbert Hoover presented Marie with the funds at a White House ceremony, and again she toured American universities and research institutions. But this trip was harder than the first had been. Marie was visibly ill, moving slowly, tiring easily. She had to cancel some scheduled appearances due to exhaustion. Still, she pressed on, fulfilling her obligations, securing the resources that would support continued research. She returned to Paris and continued working, though at a reduced pace. She spent less time in the laboratory, more time in her office reviewing papers and consulting with students. Her daughter, Eve, who had chosen not to pursue science but had instead become a musician and writer, was increasingly concerned about her mother's health. Eve saw how Marie struggled with everyday tasks, how she would need to rest after climbing stairs, how her hands shook when she tried to write. Marie dismissed these concerns, insisting that she was fine, that age brought inevitable limitations, but that she could still work, still contribute. She continued to go to the Institute regularly, to supervise research, to maintain her connection to the scientific work that had defined her life. In 1932, she attended the opening of the Radium Institute in Warsaw, a moment of profound satisfaction. The institute bore her name and stood as a monument to what Polish scientists could achieve. She toured the facilities, met with Polish researchers, and felt a sense of completion, of having honored her heritage while also contributing to France, her adopted country. Part 9. The final chapter. By 1933, Marie's health was failing unmistakably. She developed fevers that would come and go, leaving her weak and disoriented. Her hands, damaged by decades of radiation exposure, were in constant pain. The cataracts in her eyes had progressed to the point where reading was difficult even with strong glasses. She struggled with simple laboratory procedures that she had once performed effortlessly. Yet she continued to work, She would arrive at the Radium Institute in the mornings, moving slowly but purposefully through the building she had done so much to create. She would review her students' work, offer advice, participate in discussions of experimental results. The laboratory was her home in a way that nowhere else was, the place where she felt most herself, most connected to the work that gave her life meaning. She was working on a book, a comprehensive biography of Pierre, honoring the man who had been her partner and whose death still marked her nearly 30 years later. She wanted to ensure that Pierre's contributions to science were properly documented, that his memory was preserved accurately. She wrote in her study at home, working slowly due to her failing eyesight, but steadily completing the manuscript. In the spring of 1934, her condition worsened significantly. The fevers became more frequent and more severe. She was losing weight, had no appetite, felt constantly exhausted. Her doctors were puzzled. They ran tests, prescribed treatments, but nothing seemed to help. Marie resisted their suggestions that she should stop working, that she should rest completely. In May, she became seriously ill, with a fever that would not break. She finally agreed to leave Paris and travel to the San Selimo's sanatorium in the French Alps, a facility that specialized in treating tuberculosis and other chronic conditions. The mountain air and rest, her doctors hoped, might restore her strength. Eve accompanied her mother to Saint-Selmoz. They traveled by train, Marie wrapped in blankets despite the warm spring weather, shivering with fever. At the sanatorium, Marie was given a comfortable room with a view of the mountains. The air was clear and fresh, scented with pine. But the rest and mountain air did not help. Marie's fever persisted. She grew weaker. The doctors at the sanatorium conducted more tests and finally arrived at a diagnosis: aplastic pernicious anemia. Her bone marrow was failing to produce enough blood cells. The condition was irreversible and terminal. The cause, though the doctors at the time did not state it definitively, was almost certainly radiation exposure. Decades of working with radioactive materials, of handling radium and other radioactive substances with minimal protection, had damaged Marie's bone marrow beyond repair. The radiation that she had discovered and studied had, in the end, killed her. Eve stayed with her mother during those final weeks. Irene visited when she could, though she was deeply engaged in her own research and struggled to accept that her mother was dying. Marie drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and able to converse, sometimes feverish and delirious. In her lucid moments, she spoke about science, about the work still to be done, about experiments she wished she could perform. She asked about the institute, about her students' progress. Even at the end, her mind returned constantly to research, to the pursuit of knowledge that had driven her entire adult life. She died on the 4th of July, 1934, at the age of 66. Eve was with her. The death certificate listed the cause as aplastic pernicious anemia, but made no mention of radiation exposure or its role in her death. News of Marie Curie's death spread quickly through the scientific community and beyond. Tributes poured in from around the world. Scientists, students, admirers, and the simply curious mourned the loss of a figure who had become legendary in her own lifetime. The funeral was private, held in Sceaux, where Pierre had been buried. Marie was laid to rest in the same grave as her husband, finally reunited with the partner who had shared her greatest achievements and deepest joys. The ceremony was simple. Marie had never wanted elaborate displays, and her family honored that preference. The grave received 2 coffins on that day, Marie's and Pierre's, which was being transferred to join hers. It was a quiet ending for a life that had been anything but quiet, a life that had encompassed revolutionary scientific achievement, profound personal loss, public scandal, wartime service, and an unshakable dedication to the pursuit of truth through systematic investigation of nature. Epilogue. legacy, and memory. The story of Marie Curie's life did not end with her burial in 1934. Her legacy would continue to unfold in ways both expected and surprising, shaping science, politics, and culture for decades to come. The Radium Institute continued its work, becoming a center of excellence in nuclear physics and chemistry. Under the direction of scientists whom Marie had trained, the Institute contributed significantly to the understanding of radioactivity and atomic structure. When World War II came, the Institute's work took on new and terrible significance. The physics of radioactivity that Marie and Pierre had pioneered would lead to both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Irène and Frédéric Joliot-Curie continued the family tradition of groundbreaking research. In 1935, just a year after Marie's death, they were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their discovery of artificial radioactivity, the ability to create radioactive isotopes that did not exist in nature. It was a fitting tribute to Marie's legacy, proof that the research tradition she had established would continue through the next generation. The dangers of radiation, which Marie had only begun to acknowledge near the end of her life, became increasingly clear over the following decades. Radiation protection became a serious discipline, with carefully established limits on exposure and strict protocols for handling radioactive materials. Marie's own notebooks, stored in archives in Paris, remain radioactive to this day and must be handled with special precautions. They stand as a poignant reminder of the price she paid for her discoveries. In 1995, in a ceremony heavy with symbolism, Marie and Pierre Curie's remains were transferred to the Panthéon in Paris, the great monument where France's most honored citizens are interred. Marie became the first woman to be honored in the Panthéon based on her own achievements, rather than as someone's wife. The ceremony was attended by France's President, François Mitterrand, who delivered a speech acknowledging both Marie's scientific contributions and the discrimination she had faced as a woman in science. The transfer to the Panthéon required special precautions. Marie's remains were still radioactive from her lifetime exposure to radium and other radioactive materials. Her coffin was lined with lead to contain the radiation, a final irony for a woman who had spent her life studying the very phenomenon that had slowly killed her. Marie Curie's story has been told and retold in countless biographies, films, plays, and other works. She has become an icon, a symbol of different things to different people. To many, she represents the triumph of intellect and determination over adversity, the immigrant who became a celebrated scientist through sheer force of will and brilliance. To others, she embodies the struggles of women in science, fighting for recognition and opportunity in fields dominated by men. Some narratives have romanticized her life, smoothing over the complexities and contradictions to create an inspiring but simplified story. Other accounts have focused on the scandal of her relationship with Paul Langevin, sometimes reducing her life to that single episode. The truth, as always, is more complex than any simple narrative can capture. Marie Curie was brilliant, yes, but also difficult, demanding of herself and others, sometimes cold and distant, capable of holding grudges and making enemies. She was dedicated to science with a purity that was admirable, but also, at times, harmful to herself and those around her. She was brave, but also reckless with her own health and safety. She was a loving mother, but also one who sometimes seemed more comfortable in the laboratory than in the nursery. She lived through extraordinary times and experienced the full range of human triumph and tragedy. She knew the joy of discovery, the satisfaction of recognition, the happiness of partnership with someone who shared her deepest passions. She also knew profound loss, public humiliation, chronic illness, and the slow realization that the work she loved was destroying her body. Her discoveries transformed science. The identification of radioactivity as an atomic property, rather than a molecular or chemical phenomenon, helped pave the way for understanding atomic structure. The isolation of radium provided a powerful tool for research and eventually for medical treatment. The techniques she developed for processing large quantities of ore and purifying radioactive elements established methods still used today. But perhaps her most important legacy was simply demonstrating that women could pursue science at the highest levels, could make fundamental discoveries, could contribute to human knowledge as significantly as any man. In an era when women were systematically excluded from scientific institutions and academic positions, Marie Curie forced the world to acknowledge female scientific achievement. Her life was not easy. The obstacles she overcame, poverty, discrimination, personal tragedy, chronic illness, were real and daunting. She succeeded not because society supported women in science, but in spite of society's resistance. She paid a high price for her success in health, in privacy, in personal happiness. Yet she persisted. From that small apartment in Warsaw, where she had watched her father demonstrate physics experiments with makeshift equipment, through the cold attic rooms in Paris, where she studied by lamplight, through the converted shed where she and Pierre isolated radium, through the battlefields of World War I, through scandal and illness and loss, through all of it, she continued to pursue knowledge with unwavering dedication. When asked once about the most important quality for a scientist, Marie replied, "We must have perseverance, and above all, confidence in ourselves. We must believe that we are gifted for something, and that this thing must be attained." She believed in her own gift for science, and she attained the thing she sought: understanding of the natural world, contribution to human knowledge, a place in history as one of the great scientists of any era. The cost was high, perhaps too high, but she paid it willingly. The radioactive glow that had so fascinated Marie and Pierre when they gazed at their radium samples in the darkness of their laboratory was beautiful, mysterious, and deadly. It illuminated new realms of physics even as it slowly destroyed those who worked with it. Marie Curie's life paralleled this duality, brilliant and inspiring, but also marked by suffering and sacrifice. Her laboratory notebooks, still too radioactive to handle safely more than a century after she wrote in them, stand as a monument to her dedication and her fate. The pages are filled with careful observations, precise measurements, and methodical records of experiments. They document the systematic pursuit of truth through empirical investigation, the essence of scientific method applied with extraordinary rigor and determination. Those notebooks also contain, in their very structure, an invisible testament. The radiation that makes them dangerous is the same radiation that Marie discovered and characterized, that she spent her life studying, that ultimately claimed her life. They are simultaneously her greatest achievement and her epitaph, a record of discovery and a warning about the price of knowledge. In the end, Marie Curie's story is fundamentally human, a tale of ambition and achievement, love and loss, triumph and tragedy. She reached for understanding of nature's deepest mysteries and grasped truths that transformed science. She built a life dedicated to knowledge, accepting whatever sacrifices that dedication required. She worked until the very end, never quite able to step away from the research that gave her life purpose and meaning. On that summer day in 1934, when Marie Curie took her final breath in a sanatorium room in the French Alps, she left behind a transformed scientific landscape, a family that would continue her work, and a legacy that would inspire generations of scientists, particularly women, to pursue their own paths in science despite obstacles and opposition. The glow of radium that had so captivated her had faded from her failing eyes, but the light of her achievement would continue to shine, illuminating the path for those who would follow her into the mysterious, dangerous, and endlessly fascinating realm of atomic physics. Marie Skłodowska-Curie had lived the life she had chosen, had pursued the dream she had formed in a small apartment in occupied Warsaw, had achieved recognition and made contributions that would endure long after the radioactive glow faded from her notebooks and her bones. Her journey from from Polish governess to Nobel laureate, from cold attic room to the Pantheon, from obscurity to immortality, was a journey driven by an insatiable curiosity about the natural world and an unshakable belief in the value of systematic, rigorous investigation of that world. It was a journey that cost her health, privacy, and ultimately her life, but it was the journey she chose, and she would have chosen it again. The story of Marie Curie, told here in its fullness, is the story of what humans can achieve when brilliant ability meets iron determination, when passion for knowledge overcomes every obstacle, when the pursuit of truth becomes the organizing principle of a life. It is an inspiring story, but also a cautionary one, a reminder that achievement comes with costs, and that even the brightest lights cast shadows. In laboratories around the world today, scientists continue the work that Marie Curie began, studying radioactivity and atomic structure, developing medical treatments and energy sources, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. They work with safety measures that Marie never had, informed by understanding of radiation hazards that came too late to save her. They stand on foundations that she helped to build, pursuing questions that she helped to formulate, using methods that she helped to establish. And somewhere in those laboratories, perhaps, there is a young woman who has overcome her own obstacles to pursue science, who has faced discrimination and doubt but persisted, who looks to Marie Curie's example and finds in it the courage to continue her own journey. For that young scientist, and for countless others, Marie Curie's legacy lives on not just in the discoveries she made or the elements she isolated, but in the example she set of what is possible when talent meets determination, when barriers are challenged rather than accepted, when the pursuit of knowledge becomes a calling that cannot be denied. The luminous life of Marie Curie, traced here from beginning to end, from Warsaw to Paris to the Pantheon, from obscurity through fame to enduring legacy, stands as testament to the power of human curiosity and the indomitable strength of the human spirit when devoted to a cause larger than itself. Her story, in all its complexity, triumphant and tragic, inspiring and sobering, deserves to be told and remembered, a chronicle of one remarkable life, lived in pursuit of understanding the fundamental nature of matter and energy. And so it ends, as it began, with radiance, not the glow of radium this time, but the enduring light of achievement, the illumination that comes from expanding human knowledge, the luminosity of a life well lived in service of science and truth. Marie Skłodowska-Curie, born in Russian-occupied Poland in 1867, died in France in 1934, and immortalized in the annals of science and in the memory of all who value the pursuit of knowledge over the comfort of ignorance. Her story is complete, but her legacy continues, glowing still with the same mysterious radiance that first drew her to study the strange new property she named radioactivity, the property that defined her career, claimed her life, and secured her place in history as one of science's true luminaries. Thank you for joining this gentle journey through Marie Curie's life. If you enjoyed this calm storytelling, feel free to return any time for more peaceful history. Sleep well, and good night.